Welcome to the Old Roads Podcast, a podcast that seeks to bring the wisdom of the past to the challenges of the present. I am your host, Aaron O'Kelly. I'm a pastor and a theological educator. We now move into the month of November, and that means a new topic for this month. And the topic I'm going to focus on this month is Calvinism. The question I'm raising today is, what is Calvinism? A short answer to that question would be, Calvinism is a system of doctrine that emphasizes the sovereignty of God in salvation. Salvation, according to Calvinists, is by grace alone from beginning to end, from God's choice of us in eternity past, all the way to our perseverance in faith to the end, to glorification. I want to ask the question, what is Calvinism from a more historical perspective today so that we can understand what is its role in church history, what is its place, what are the nuances of what Calvinists have taught and believe, where did it come from? And I have a particular interest in this subject for a couple of reasons. One is that when I was in college, my very first semester in college, this was in fall of 1999, I did a paper on Calvinism as I was personally interested in the questions that it raised about election and God's sovereignty in salvation. And I originally came out against it in my study of the Bible and theology as a freshman in college. But after I turned in my paper, after I made my case against it, I ended up continuing to wrestle with the questions that it posed, and most importantly, wrestled with the biblical texts. And I remember in my dorm room in early 2000, I was reading Romans 9 again. And Romans 9 simply convinced me. I didn't understand at the time all the nuances, and I didn't have all the answers to my questions, but I did have from Romans 9 a very clear vision of the sovereignty of God in salvation. And I'll get into Romans 9 a bit more in a future episode, but today I just want to focus on the historical questions about Calvinistic theology. So my personal experience has played into the interest that I have in it, but I've also seen how the term Calvinism has been misused and abused as a scare tactic in a number of churches. And these are often churches in rural settings. They tend to be in rural settings. And what will happen is a young pastor, probably a younger pastor, is leading a church in a rural setting, and he may lead in a direction that the deacons don't like. And he may take some initiative that the deacons are not very fond of. And as a result, the deacons will want to push back, and eventually they might want to get him fired. And in order to do that, they will often introduce this idea of Calvinism. They'll say, well, brother so-and-so is a Calvinist, and that is a fringe, scary theological doctrine that doesn't align with who we are as a church, so we need to let him go. Now, I would argue that in probably the vast majority of cases, Calvinism was not the presenting issue. It was something else involved in the pastor's leadership. But the deacons of the church have been trained by perhaps local directors of missions or some other circulated literature, or perhaps YouTube theologians who have their ministries online and are devoted entirely to arguing against Calvinism. They raise all these scare tactics to bring great questions about the pastor and about his teachings that are tied to this scary word, Calvinism, that the people in the pews don't understand. And when they hear about it, they assume it's bad. And so it can often be an excuse to get young pastors fired. I've seen it happen. And I do believe it is a pernicious way to use this term and to misuse it. And so one of the things I want to do today is just set the record straight. What is Calvinism historically? Is it a scary theological fringe movement that we need to run away from? Is it something that we need to warn against? Or has it had much of a mainstream place in historic Protestant theology? In fact, the latter is the case. Calvinism, historically and rightly understood, has been a mainstream Protestant teaching. That is important for us to grasp. It is not fringe. It is not heretical. It is not on the margins of the church. Among Protestant Christians, it has been in the mainstream from the beginning of the Reformation. And even going back before the Reformation, elements of Calvinism were mainstream even before that. So I want to just give an overview today of the history of Calvinistic teaching and more of a definition of what Calvinism actually does teach based on historical theology. And so here's a brief history of Calvinism. First of all, I want to recommend my episodes from May 2025, in which I explored the doctrine of sin. And in part of exploring that, I got into the issues between Augustine and Pelagius. Augustine, a 4th and 5th century theologian, and the debates he had with Pelagius over the nature of sin. Pelagius arguing that we were not affected by Adam's sin directly. It was only a bad example for us. And Augustine arguing that no, sin actually has permeated every part of our being. And so salvation must rescue us from the effects of sin. God's grace must reach to every part of us, and God in sovereign grace must bring us back to spiritual life. Pelagianism was condemned in the early church by the Council of Ephesus in the year 431 AD. And of course, it's never been mainstream Christianity. Semi-Pelagianism, which is the view that prevenient grace or God's grace is not necessary for us to be saved in the sense that it has to go before our action. Semi-Pelagians would say God's grace is necessary, but we can make the first move toward God. So grace doesn't have to go first. That view was also condemned by some local councils in the early centuries of the church, but it still held on. And semi-Pelagianism, I believe, has endured as a subset among Christianity down to this very day. So semi-Pelagianism has still been around. Of course, Pelagianism is still around, but it's been condemned as heresy. Semi-Pelagianism has tended to fly more under the radar, so to speak. But Augustinianism really did win the day in the early centuries of the church, and Augustinianism upheld a strong view of God's sovereignty. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, Augustinianism was modified and softened in some ways. And that brings us down then to the time of the Reformation. And so in the Reformation, which began in the 16th century, you should think of the Reformation as having basically 3 branches. Protestantism could be described as including the branch of Lutheranism, the branch of the Reformed churches, and then the branch of the radicals, which would be the groups we tend to call Anabaptists. Of course, the Anabaptists or the Radical Reformation, they were not Calvinists in their understanding of sin and salvation. Of course, Lutherans are not Calvinists either, but Martin Luther himself and a number of Lutheran theologians did hold to doctrines that overlap with Calvinism when it comes to predestination, election, sin, and so forth. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But think of those 3 branches: Lutherans, the Reformed, and the Radicals. Of course, the Reformed would be the ones we're focusing on here today, especially with this idea of Calvinism. But let's talk first about Lutheranism. In 1525, Martin Luther published his book, his famous debate with Erasmus of Rotterdam, and it was called The Bondage of the Will. And in this book, Luther made a case for what we would call today the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity. It is the understanding that the will is bound to sin, and that we cannot escape from sin by our own efforts, but the grace of God is required. God, acting in sovereign grace, must deliver us from the power of sin. Luther was very strong on this point, and Luther held to a strong view of God's sovereignty in election, predestination, and salvation. Later Lutheranism, I believe, tended to modify Luther on this, but Luther himself was, you might say, very Calvinistic, at least when it came to election, predestination, and sin. And so he is one figure who factors largely here in the time of the Reformation. If you look at the Reformed churches, of course, John Calvin, for whom Calvinism is named, Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564, published many works of theology and biblical exegesis, his most famous being the Institutes of the Christian Religion. There were 6 editions published throughout Calvin's career of the Institutes, and his chapters on election and predestination started appearing in the 2nd edition, which was published in 1539. His last edition was published in 1559, just a few years before his death. So Calvin wrote on these things. It wasn't the preoccupation of his theology, but he did write about election, predestination, the sovereignty of God and salvation. But he is not the only Reformed theologian writing about these things around this time, nor was he even the first. There were other first-generation reformers. He was a second generation, but there were first-generation reformers writing about these things before he was. Martin Bucer, Ulrich Zwingli, and others writing about God's sovereignty in salvation. So this became a standard Reformed teaching, and it wasn't originally from John Calvin. John Calvin was just the most gifted, you might say, of the initial reformers, I believe, the one who synthesized and disseminated Reformed ideas most widely. As you move a little further, you get to a Reformed theologian named Jacob Arminius, who lived from 1560 to 1609. So Arminius was born right at the end of Calvin's life, and he was trained in the Reformed faith. But Jacob Arminius began to teach some different doctrines regarding the nature of sin and salvation, and his movement was known as the movement of the Remonstrants. And Arminius raised some questions about accepted Reformed teaching, and so his followers really were the ones who proposed these ideas in a more formal way, and they proposed them after the time of Jacob Arminius' death. They proposed them as the 5 articles of Remonstrance. And these were the 5 articles that the Remonstrants, or Arminians as they've been called, proposed for consideration. The first article was called conditional election. And this means that God saves those whom he foreknows will believe the gospel and persevere in the faith. So the priority comes to man's free will in believing the gospel and persevering, and God, foreknowing who will do that, chooses them to be saved. The next article of the Remonstrance was unlimited atonement, meaning that Jesus Christ died to make possible the salvation of all people. His death was intended to save any and all who would come, and did not actually secure the salvation of anyone, but made it possible for those who freely believed the gospel to be saved. The third, you may be surprised at this, but the Arminians actually did affirm total depravity, meaning they affirmed that sin extends to every part of man's being, and that man is spiritually dead in sin. But combined with this, they also affirmed prevenient grace that is resistible. So let me explain what that means. Prevenient grace simply means grace that goes before. So God's grace comes to us who are dead in our sins before we do anything in response to God. Arminians agree with that, but they would argue this prevenient grace is resistible. So we have the power to resist that grace or to cooperate with it. So those who cooperate with prevenient grace come to faith in Christ and are saved. Those who resist it in their sin are left in their sin and ultimately condemned. So the Arminians are not semi-Pelagians. The semi-Pelagians would say that we don't need prevenient grace to be saved. We are capable of making the first step toward God. The Arminians would say, no, we're not. Prevenient grace must come to us and give us some measure of spiritual life that then enables us to cooperate, or, if we so choose, to resist unto our destruction. And then the fifth, so those would be the third and the fourth points of the Remonstrance. The fifth article of the Remonstrance was at least raising the question about perseverance in the faith. They raised the question that perhaps not all who believe the gospel persevere in faith to the end. They weren't committal on that point yet, but the Remonstrants at that time were at least saying the accepted Reformed teaching that all who believe the gospel will persevere in faith to the end. That's at least worth questioning, they said, and they wanted to consider that issue further. So in response to these 5 articles of the Remonstrance, the Reformed churches throughout Europe held a council that is called a synod, and this has come to be known as the Synod of Dort because it was held in a city in the Netherlands from 1618 to 1619, and it was again a gathering of international theologians who considered these questions of the Remonstrance biblically, theologically, and they came up with what were called the Canons of Dort that they issued as a response to the 5 articles of the Remonstrance. The Synod of Dort issued in response an affirmation first of unconditional election. So in contrast to the Arminian view of conditional election, the Synod of Dort said, no, election to salvation is unconditional. God chooses in his freedom, without any regard to what is in man, those whom he will save. He chooses out of the mass of fallen humanity. He doesn't owe it to anyone, but he chooses some to be saved, and he has left the others justly to perish under the guilt of their sin. They also affirmed limited atonement, or what is called particular redemption, the view that Christ's mission in his death and resurrection was to save those whom God had chosen to be saved. That doesn't mean that the gospel can't be preached to all. In fact, the gospel must be preached to all, but Jesus specifically purchased the redemption of God's elect on the cross. They also affirmed total depravity in agreement with the Arminians, but combined with that, they argued for an irresistible prevenient grace. They argued that God's grace and salvation comes to his elect, and it is ultimately irresistible, meaning that the elect will not finally resist God's grace. God will ensure that he brings them to faith. He doesn't coerce them to faith, but he gives them new spiritual life so that they believe the gospel. And God will have his elect people come to faith. He has the power to accomplish that, and he will. And then finally, they affirmed the perseverance of the saints, meaning that all who come to faith, true faith, will endure to the end. Why? Because God has chosen them from eternity past. God is not going to fail to fulfill his eternal decree for their salvation. So once they come to faith, once they have new spiritual life, they will not fall away because the power of God will keep them in faith. These were the 5 canons of the Synod of Dort that were issued in response to the 5 articles of the Remonstrance. Now, the term Calvinism was not really used at this time to refer to these 5 points. It was more used by Lutherans starting in the 1550s to refer to those Reformed theologians who held to a different understanding of the Lord's Supper than the Lutherans did. So Calvinism, at least in the beginning, was more in reference to the Lord's Supper than to anything else. But in the 18th century, people started to use the term Calvinism to refer to what the Synod of Dort propounded in its 5 articles. And these came to be known as the 5 points of Calvinism. And it really wasn't until the 20th century that these 5 points were reordered, at least for English speakers, so that they could be easily remembered by the acronym TULIP. And so you notice when I laid them out a while ago, I did it in the order in which the Synod propounded them, which was unconditional election and then limited atonement, total depravity, irresistible grace, and perseverance. English speakers today tend to use the acronym TULIP with a reordering of those to mean total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. You can see the first letter in each spells out the word TULIP. So it can be easy to remember that way. So if you use TULIP to help you remember the 5 points of Calvinism, more power to you. It's a very helpful tool to remember what they are. All of this is to say, is Calvinism a fringe view? Does it belong on the margins of the Christian church? Is it heresy, or is it a scary teaching that we should flee from and warn against and listen to all the YouTubers out there who are telling us that we should absolutely reject this fringe theology? Well, that is absolutely not true. It is not fringe. It is mainstream Reformed doctrine and has been from the beginning of the Reformation. And that means that today, Presbyterian and Reformed churches have a strong Calvinistic history. Not all of them today necessarily are Calvinistic in their teaching, but they have a strong Calvinistic heritage that gave rise to their denominations in the beginning. That'd be Presbyterian and Reformed. That also includes the Anglican churches of today and all the various Anglican groups around the world. Anglicanism began as a Reformed church. And so the Anglican churches, which would include the Episcopal Church, the Anglican denominations that have arisen in Africa and here in North America and elsewhere, these have a Calvinistic heritage. Congregationalists originally split off from the Church of England, but they were Calvinistic in their heritage. And among some of those Congregationalists in England, you had the rise of Baptist churches. So Baptists historically are Calvinistic. Now, in the beginning, there were actually 2 streams of Baptists, the General Baptist and the Particular Baptist. The General Baptists were more Arminian in their theology. That's why they're called general. They held to a general or unlimited atonement. The particular Baptists were Calvinistic in their theology, holding to a particular redemption or limited atonement. And most Baptist churches today are descendants of the particular Baptist. That is important to grasp. The Southern Baptist Convention is very much in the lineage of the particular Baptists that originally rose in England. If you look back through Baptist confessions of faith, you see very strong Calvinistic theology. Look at the Second London Baptist Confession from 1689. It is Calvinistic through and through. It was simply modified in a few ways, but it was made the standard confession for Baptist churches in America in the 1700s through what is called the Philadelphia Confession. And so Baptist churches in America, as they began to proliferate, were very Calvinistic on the whole. Even today, among the Southern Baptist Convention, we hold to what is called the Baptist Faith and Message as our confession of faith, and it's rooted in an earlier confession called the New Hampshire Confession. Even it is Calvinistic, gently so, you might say, but it is definitely Calvinistic in its statement on election, regeneration. And so the Southern Baptist Convention's official confession of faith has at least a broadly Calvinistic heritage and a very strong Calvinistic history behind it. So Calvinism is not on the margins. It's been in the mainstream of Protestant Christianity from the very beginning. There are, of course, non-Calvinist denominations as well. Lutheran denominations, of course, are non-Calvinistic today, even though Luther himself held to some aspects of this doctrine. The Methodist churches of today, founded by John Wesley, which was a splinter from Anglicanism, they are non-Calvinistic. They are explicitly Arminian in their teaching. And all the offshoots that come from Methodism today, the holiness churches and other splinter groups from Methodism, we would identify as more Arminian in their theology today. But what I wanted to show with this brief historical overview is that Calvinism is definitely part of the mainstream. It is definitely part of Protestant Christian heritage, and even aspects of it go back before that into the 4th century with Augustine especially. And so the teaching of Calvinism is not fringe. It is not something to be afraid of. It is well within the mainstream of Protestant and especially Baptist theology. So if you're part of a church where the deacons are trying to get the pastor run off and they're using Calvinism as a word to scare you, I would just urge you to reconsider. Don't follow the mob into condemning something you don't fully understand. If you've listened to this podcast, hopefully you have a better understanding of what Calvinism is. And if you want to know, is it biblical? I'm going to address that question next week. So we'll be looking into the biblical teaching regarding Calvinism starting next week, and then following that, looking at some of the practical effects of Calvinistic teaching. So don't be scared of the term. Let's learn more about what it actually means. If you benefited from this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite app. Leave us a review. We'd love to get reviews from listeners, especially 5-star reviews, because those help us get the word out to others. And most importantly, share this with a friend who could benefit. If you have a particular episode you could send to help a friend with a question he may have, that's such a help to us as well. You can submit questions for our monthly Q&A episode at theoldroadspodcast.com. You can also sign up there to be a patron if you would like to support us. And we are grateful to those patrons who support us financially. Until next time, remember Jeremiah 6:16, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls."